December 28th, 1943, Ortona, Italy. Captain William Morrison crouched in the rubble of what had once been someone's bedroom. Plaster dust coated his uniform like fresh snow. His fingers trembled as they gripped the detonator. 30 seconds. That was all the time he had left to make a decision that would either kill every man in his platoon or defeat the most elite fighting force Adolf Hitler had ever created. Through the shattered wall beside him, he could hear them, German voices, laughing. The sound was close. Too close. The paratroopers on the other side of that brick barrier had no idea what was about to happen. They had fought at Crete. They had survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad. They had crushed British commandos and American Rangers. They called themselves the Green Devils. They had never lost. And right now they were laughing at the Canadians. Morrison looked down at the wire in his hand. 20 seconds. His brain screamed at him to think, to calculate, to find another way. But there was no other way. Not anymore. Not after what the Germans had done to Lieutenant Fraser. Not after the building collapse. Not after Christmas Day. His finger moved to the trigger. 15 seconds. The morning light filtered through the destroyed ceiling above him, illuminating thousands of dust particles hanging in the frozen air. Each mote caught the December sun, turning the ruins into something almost beautiful, almost peaceful. Morrison knew that in 15 seconds this piece would shatter into fire and screaming and death. 10 seconds. He thought of his brother Jack. Jack, who had died at Dieppe because some British general thought frontal assaults still worked in modern warfare. Jack, whose last letter home had said, "Don't worry, Bill. The brass knows what they're doing." The brass had known nothing. Morrison's jaw tightened. His hand stopped shaking. 5 seconds. On the other side of that wall, a German paratrooper was probably thinking about going home, about seeing his family again, about surviving this godforsaken war. Morrison knew this because he thought about the same things every single day, but only one of them was going to make it out of this room alive. 3 seconds. The wire felt hot in his palm despite the December cold. 2 seconds. He closed his eyes. 1. Morrison pressed the detonator. But to understand why a wheat farmer from Alberta, Canada was about to blow a hole through solid brick and charge into a room full of elite German paratroopers, you have to go back. Back to before the war. Back to when William Morrison was just a man who knew how to fix tractors and plant winter wheat. Back to when the idea of killing another human being was as foreign to him as the dark side of the moon. 8 days earlier, Morrison had been a different person. The prairies of Western Canada stretched endlessly in every direction from his family's farm. 3,000 acres of wheat, barley, and open skishmay. In the summer, you could stand on the porch of the farmhouse and see the curve of the earth itself. In winter, that same horizon turned white and brutal, teaching you that nature didn't care about your plans or your comfort or your life. That kind of land makes a certain type of man. Quiet, resourceful, stubborn as a January blizzard. William Morrison had spent 28 years becoming that man. He could strip an engine blindfolded. He could predict weather by the smell of the wind. He could work 18-hour days during harvest without complaint. What he could not do, had never learned to do, was quit. September 1939 changed everything. Morrison remembered the night war was declared. He and his younger brother Jack had gathered around the radio in the farmhouse kitchen. Their mother stood by the stove, hands twisted in her apron. The broadcaster's voice crackled through the static, formal and distant, announcing that Great Britain and France had declared war on Germany. Canada, as part of the British Commonwealth, would follow. Jack's eyes had lit up with something Morrison didn't recognize at first. It took him a moment to understand. Excitement. His kid brother was excited about war. "We should go," Jack had said. "We should sign up." Morrison had shaken his head. "Farm needs us. Ma needs us." "The farm will be here when we get back," Jack replied. "This is our chance to do something that matters." Their mother said nothing, just kept twisting that apron, her knuckles white. Morrison had held out for almost 3 years. While Jack enlisted with the Calgary Highlanders, Morrison stayed home. Someone had to keep the farm running. Someone had to make sure the wheat got planted and harvested. Canada needed food as much as it needed soldiers. That's what he told himself, anyway. The truth he never spoke aloud was that Morrison was terrified. Not of dying. The prairies taught you that death was just part of the cycle. But of dying stupidly. of throwing his life away because some officer who'd never held a rifle made a mistake. Then came August 1942. Morrison was in the north field when he saw the truck coming down the long dirt road to the farmhouse. Even from a mile away, he knew. You always knew. The truck moved too slowly, too deliberately, like it was carrying something precious and terrible. He'd walk back across the wheat, each step taking forever and no time at all. By the time he reached the house, his mother was already on the porch holding the telegram. Jack Morrison, killed in action, Dieppe, France, August 19, 1942. The telegram didn't explain what had happened. It would be months before Morrison learned the truth. That British command had sent 5,000 Canadians to assault the French port of Dieppe, with no air support, no naval bombardment, and no realistic chance of success. That the Germans had been waiting. That the beaches had turned red with Canadian blood. That of the 3,000 men who made it ashore, only 2,000 came back. That Jack had died in the first 5 minutes of the assault cut down on the beach before he even reached the seawall. Morrison read his brother's last letter that night. Jack had written it 3 days before Dieppe. "Don't worry, Bill," it said. "The brass knows what they're doing. This is going to be a big show. I'll write you all about it when I get back." Morrison folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Then he walked into town and enlisted. He made himself one promise. Jack had died following orders from men who didn't know what they were doing. Morrison would follow orders right up until those orders got him killed. Then he would make his own. The Canadian Army in 1942 was desperate for men. They took Morrison without question. Farmer, age 26, strong, smart, able to fix machinery. Within weeks, he was on a troop ship heading for England. That's where he met James Mackenzie. Mackenzie was everything Morrison wasn't: loud, cheerful, built like a tree trunk. He'd worked as a logger in the forests of British Columbia before the war, felling cedars that were older than Canada itself. His hands were scarred from chainsaw work. His laugh could fill a room. They met during basic training in southern England, standing in line for mess hall dinner. Mackenzie looked at Morrison's unit patch. "Alberta," Mackenzie said. "Wheat farmer." Morrison nodded. "Lumberjack," Mackenzie replied, sticking out a massive hand. "James Mackenzie, Jimmy to anyone who doesn't make me angry." They shook. Morrison felt calluses that matched his own. "What brings a tree cutter to the infantry?" Morrison asked. Mackenzie's grin faded just slightly. "Heard about France falling in 40. Figured if the Germans can roll over the French that easy, they might come for us next. Rather fight them here than in the forest back home." It was the most honest answer Morrison had heard since joining up. Most men talked about duty or glory or adventure. Mackenzie just wanted to keep the war away from the trees he loved. Besides, Mackenzie added, his grin returning. "How hard can it be? Point rifle at Germans, pull trigger. Go home." Morrison almost smiled. Almost. They became friends the way soldiers do, not through long conversations or shared interests, but through the simple fact of being in the same place facing the same future. When you don't know if you'll be alive next month, friendship becomes efficient. Training in England was strange. The Canadian 1st Division drilled in the countryside, practicing maneuvers that were supposed to prepare them for France. They learned how to advance under artillery fire, how to dig trenches, how to coordinate with tanks. Everything the generals had learned from the Great War 25 years earlier. What they didn't learn was how to fight in cities. Nobody thought to teach them that. The assumption was that modern warfare happened in fields and forests and open ground. Urban combat was considered a rare exception, something that only happened when a siege went wrong. Morrison practiced advancing across meadows. He learned to navigate hedgerows. He became expert at reading topographical maps of open country, but he never once trained to clear a building, never learned to fight room to room, never even considered that walls could be tactical assets. This would matter later. In November 1943, the 1st Division shipped out to Italy. The landings at Sicily had succeeded. The Italian government had surrendered. The Allies were pushing north toward Rome. Victory felt close, inevitable. The reality was different. Italy was not France. Italy was mountains and mud and rivers that turned into torrents overnight. The Germans had retreated to defensive positions called the Winter Line, anchored on terrain that made attackers pay for every mile in blood. Along the Adriatic coast, the British 8th Army was trying to punch through to Rome. The Canadians were part of that effort. They slogged through rain and frozen ground fighting for villages whose names they couldn't pronounce. That's when Morrison met Thomas Chen. Private Chen was 22 years old, Chinese-Canadian, born in Vancouver. His grandfather had helped build the Canadian Pacific Railway laying track across the Rockies in conditions that killed hundreds of workers. His father ran a garage in Chinatown, teaching young Thomas how engines worked before the boy could read. Chen had enlisted in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. The recruiter had looked at him with obvious doubt. "You sure about this, son?" the recruiter had asked. "War's not for everyone." Chen had met his eyes without blinking. "My family built the railway that connects this country. I think I can handle a rifle." He'd made it through training on pure skill. While other recruits struggled with weapons maintenance, Chen could field strip a Bren gun in 30 seconds flat. When a truck broke down during maneuvers, Chen fixed it with wire and a prayer. He was brilliant with anything mechanical. He was also quiet. Chen had learned early that speaking up in the army brought attention, and attention for a Chinese Canadian usually meant trouble. Better to keep your head down. Do your job. Prove yourself through action. Morrison first noticed Chen during a river crossing exercise. The unit's assault boat had an engine problem. While the sergeant yelled and the other men stood around uselessly, Chen had calmly pulled the outboard motor apart, identified a fouled spark plug, cleaned it with its shirt, and had them running in 5 minutes. Morrison walked over afterward. "That was good work." Chen nodded but said nothing. "You know explosives too?" Morrison asked. Chen's eyes flickered with interest. "Some. My dad taught me about combustion engines. The principles are similar." "Stick close," Morrison said. "I think we're going to need someone who understands how things blow up." This casual conversation would save dozens of lives. By December 1943, the 1st Canadian Division had been fighting in Italy for months. They were no longer the fresh-faced recruits who'd shipped out from England. They'd seen men die. They'd learned that war wasn't adventure or glory. It was mud and exhaustion and random death. But they still hadn't faced what was coming. On December 19th, the division received new orders. There was a town called Ortona, blocking the coastal road. Small place, ancient, built on a cliff overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. The plan was to take it quickly, then push north. Morrison looked at the aerial photographs during the briefing. Narrow streets, buildings packed tight together, medieval architecture with thick stone walls. Every military instinct he'd developed screamed that this was wrong. "Sir," he said to Lieutenant Fraser, "this looks like it could be difficult." Fraser was a good officer, former school teacher from Ontario, smart, careful, genuinely cared about his men. But he trusted headquarters. "Intelligence says the Germans are pulling back," Fraser replied. "Light resistance expected. We go in fast, secure the town, move on." Morrison wanted to argue, wanted to point out that intelligence had said Dieppe would be lightly defended too. But he was a captain, Fraser was a lieutenant, and the chain of command was the chain of command. "Yes, sir," Morrison said. That night he wrote a letter to his mother, told her he was fine, told her the weather was cold but manageable, told her he thought about Jack every day. He didn't tell her that tomorrow they were going into a town that looked like a meat grinder. Didn't tell her that his instincts were screaming danger. He sealed the letter and tried to sleep. Across the line in the ruins of Ortona, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber was also writing a letter. Weber was 32 years old, a career soldier. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1936, trained as a paratrooper, and jumped into Crete in 1941 during one of the most brutal airborne assaults in history. He'd survived the frozen nightmare of the Russian front. He'd earned the Iron Cross twice. Now he commanded a company of the 1st Parachute Division. The Fallschirmjäger, the Green Devils, they were the elite of the elite. Men who had proven themselves in the worst combat zones of the war. Hitler personally trusted them. When a position had to be held at all costs, the Green Devils held it. Weber's letter was to his wife Maria in Berlin. He wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word. "My dearest Maria," he began, "I hope this letter finds you and Greta well. I think of you both constantly. Please tell our daughter that Papa loves her very much and will come home as soon as this war allows." He paused, pen hovering over paper. What else could he say? That he was defending a town that would probably be destroyed, that he was placing men in positions where they would likely die, that he no longer believed in the cause but believed absolutely in the men under his command. None of that could be written. Instead, he wrote about the weather, about the view of the Adriatic from the church tower, about hoping to be home for Greta's 6th birthday in February. He didn't write about the defenses his chief engineer Unteroffizier Klaus Richter had spent 3 weeks building. Didn't mention the MG-42 machine gun positions covering every street. Didn't describe the mines and booby traps. Didn't explain how they'd turned every building into a fortress. Weber sealed the letter and looked out at the dark streets of Ortona. Somewhere out there, Canadian soldiers were preparing to attack. He knew this because intelligence was good. The Canadians would come tomorrow or the next day. They would come because those were their orders. And Weber would kill them because those were his orders. He thought about his daughter, 5 years old, blonde hair and pigtails. She loved her stuffed bear and hated vegetables and laughed at everything. She had no idea what her father did for a living. To her, Papa was just someone who was away a lot but sent letters. Weber wondered what she would think of him if she knew the truth. He put the thought aside. Sentiment was dangerous in war. You survived by staying focused, by following training, by trusting in your skills and the skills of the men around you. The Green Devils had never been defeated. They would not be defeated by Canadians. Weber checked his watch. 0200 hours. He should sleep. The battle would come soon enough. But sleep wouldn't come. So he sat in the darkness and waited. Back in the Canadian lines, Morrison couldn't sleep either. He stood outside his tent, looking toward Ortona. The town was just a dark mass against the slightly less dark sky. No lights, no movement, silent and waiting. Mackenzie found him there. "Can't sleep either," the big logger asked. Morrison shook his head. "That place looks wrong," Mackenzie said. "Too quiet." "Yeah." They stood together in the cold, two men from the western wilderness of Canada, about to walk into an ancient Italian town and fight Germans they'd never met for reasons that seemed increasingly distant. "You ever think about after?" Mackenzie asked. "When this is all done?" "Sometimes." "I'm going back to the trees," Mackenzie said. "Find a nice quiet forest. Cut timber. Never see another human being if I can help it." Morrison almost smiled. "Sounds good." "What about you?" Morrison thought about the farm, about wheat fields stretching to the horizon, about the simple rhythm of planting and harvesting, about never again having to point a rifle at another man. "Same," he said. "Just want to go home." Mackenzie nodded. Then after a long pause, "Think we'll make it?" Morrison looked at his friend, at this giant of a man who could fell trees with an axe and who laughed like summer thunder and who was asking very quietly if they were going to die tomorrow. "I don't know," Morrison said, because honesty was all they had left. "But I'll tell you this, if we do go, we're taking some of them with us." Mackenzie's grin flashed in the darkness. "Damn right." They stood there until dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Then they went back to their tents to prepare. Within 24 hours, they would discover that everything they knew about warfare was wrong, that the enemy was more prepared than anyone had imagined, that the streets of Ortona were designed by medieval minds for medieval combat, and the Germans had turned those ancient passages into a three-dimensional nightmare. Within 24 hours, Morrison would lose more men than he'd lost in all the previous months of combat combined. Within 24 hours, he would understand why the international press was already calling this place Little Stalingrad. But he didn't know any of that yet. Right now, as the sun rose over Italy on December 20th, 1943, Captain William Morrison was just a farmer who wanted to go home. And Hauptmann Friedrich Weber was just a father who wanted to see his daughter again. The war in its infinite cruelty would give neither of them what they wanted, at least not in the way they expected. December 20th, 1943, dawn. The first light came cold and gray over Ortona. Morrison watched the sun rise from behind a stone wall on the outskirts of town, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Around him, 32 men checked their weapons one final time. The sound of metal on metal, bolts sliding, magazines clicking into place. The small sounds that meant men were preparing to kill or be killed. Lieutenant Fraser moved down the line, speaking quietly to each section. When he reached Morrison, he paused. "Ready, Captain." Morrison looked toward the town. In the growing light, he could see the buildings more clearly now. Stone houses pressed together like teeth. Narrow streets that twisted and turned. Church towers rising above the red tile roofs. It looked medieval because it was medieval. Some of these structures had stood for 600 years. Morrison wondered how many of them would still be standing tomorrow. "Ready as we'll get," he said. Fraser nodded. He looked young in the dawn light. Too young. He was 30 years old, but right now he looked barely 20. Morrison had noticed this about combat. It either aged you instantly or made you look like a child playing soldier. "Intelligence says light resistance," Fraser repeated. It sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "We go in fast, secure the main square hold for reinforcements." Morrison said nothing. His instincts were screaming. Every nerve in his body told him this was wrong. But orders were orders. At exactly 0600 hours, the artillery opened up. The sound was immense. 25-pounder guns firing from positions 2 miles behind them. The shells screamed overhead like freight trains, their passage tearing the air itself. Morrison watched them impact on the far side of Ortona. Orange flashes. Columns of smoke and dust rising into the morning sky. The ground shook. For 30 minutes, the guns pounded the town. It was supposed to soften the defenses, destroy German positions, make the infantry's job easier. It did none of those things. At 0630, the barrage lifted. The sudden silence felt wrong. Morrison's ears rang. Around him, men rose from cover. This was it. Time to move. Fraser raised his hand, then dropped it. The Canadians advanced. They moved in a loose skirmish line, rifles ready covering each other as they approached the first buildings. Morrison's section took the right flank. Mackenzie's group moved up the center. Chen stayed close to Morrison, carrying extra ammunition and the radio. The first 100 yards were easy. Too easy. They crossed open ground without a shot being fired. Reached the outskirts of town. Still nothing. Morrison's unease grew with every step. They entered the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, the main street running into the heart of Ortona. The road was paved with ancient cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. Buildings rose 3 stories high on either side, creating a canyon of stone and shadow. 50 yards in, Morrison saw the first sign of trouble. A building on the left had collapsed into the street. Not from artillery. This was deliberate. The rubble formed a barrier 8 feet high, completely blocking the road. Morrison stopped, studied it. The debris was too perfect, too precisely placed. "Sir," he called to Fraser, "this is engineered. They want us to stop here." Fraser moved up, examining the obstacle. "Can we clear it?" "Not quickly, and not without exposing ourselves." Behind them, a Sherman tank rumbled up. Corporal Robert Dufresne commanded it from the turret, his Quebecois accent thick even through the radio static. "We can push through," Dufresne said. "Give us 5 minutes." The tank moved forward, tracks grinding on cobblestones. It reached the rubble pile and began to climb. The Sherman tilted up at a steep angle, treads churning. For a moment, Morrison thought it would make it over. Then the machine gun opened fire. The sound was distinctive. Not the crack of rifles, but a tearing noise like canvas being ripped. 1,200 rounds per minute, the German MG-42, the deadliest machine gun in the world. The bullets didn't hit the tank. They hit the infantry following it. Morrison saw Private Johnson go down first. The young man from Saskatchewan had been walking alongside the Sherman. The MG-42 burst, caught him in the legs. He fell screaming. Medic Corporal Davies ran toward him without thinking. It was instinct. See a wounded man, help him. The sniper shot took Davies through the throat. Morrison watched the medic collapse. Watched the spray of red against ancient stone. Watched Davies try to speak and fail and die in 5 seconds. And he still couldn't see where the shots were coming from. "Contact front," someone yelled. Useless information. Everyone knew there was contact. What they needed to know was where. Another burst from the MG-42. This time Morrison saw the muzzle flash. Second floor window, 70 yards ahead. He raised his rifle, but the flash disappeared before he could aim. "Suppressive fire on that window," Fraser shouted. 10 rifles opened up. Bullets sparked off stone around the window frame. Glass shattered, but the MG-42 fired again from a different position. First floor now, different building. Morrison understood. They weren't fighting one machine gun. They were fighting a network. "Fall back," Fraser ordered. "Back to the square." The Canadians retreated, dragging their wounded. They left Johnson and Davies in the street. There was no choice. Anyone who went for the bodies would die. Morrison was the last one back. He took cover behind a fountain in a small piazza at the street entrance. His heart hammered. His hands shook. Around him, men gasped for breath. The entire engagement had lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes. 7 casualties. Mackenzie crawled over blood running from a cut on his shoulder. Shrapnel from a ricochet. "What the hell was that?" the logger gasped. Morrison shook his head. He was trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand the tactical situation. They'd advanced 50 yards into town and been stopped cold. But it wasn't just being stopped that bothered him. It was how. The Germans hadn't panicked, hadn't fired wildly. They'd waited until the Canadians were committed, then hit them from multiple angles simultaneously. The machine gun positions had interlocking fields of fire. The rubble barrier had been placed at exactly the right spot to force the infantry to bunch up. This wasn't improvisation. This was engineering. Chen appeared beside Morrison, breathing hard. "Sir, I saw something. When that first MG fired, there was dust from above the window. Above? Like someone was moving on the floor overhead. I think they're not just in the rooms. They're using the whole building, moving vertically." Morrison processed this. It made terrible sense. The buildings in Ortona were connected. Shared walls, interior staircases. A defender could fire from the second-floor retreat to the third cross through the attic to the next building, fire again from a completely different angle. It was 3-dimensional warfare, and the Canadians were trained for 2 dimensions. "We need to tell Fraser," Morrison said, but Fraser was already calling for orders from battalion. Morrison could hear the radio chatter. Battalion wanted them to push forward. Secure the town by nightfall. The offensive couldn't stop for 1 block street. Fraser looked sick, but he gave the order. "We try again. Different approach. Mackenzie, take your section up the left side street. Morrison, you go right. We flank the main road and meet in the center." Morrison wanted to argue, wanted to say this was suicide. But Fraser's eyes told him the lieutenant already knew. Orders from above. No choice. "Yes, sir." They moved out at 0800 hours. Morrison's section took a narrow alley running parallel to the Corso. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. Washing lines still hung between buildings, forgotten laundry frozen stiff. Morrison moved slowly, checking every window, every door. They made it 20 yards before the booby trap. Private Henderson reached a doorway and tried the handle. The door was unlocked. It swung open easily. Too easily. Morrison saw the wire a half-second before Henderson did. "Don't." The grenade was rigged to the door frame. German stick grenade handle tied to the hinge. When the door opened, the handle pulled free. 4-second fuse. Henderson saw it. His eyes went wide. He tried to throw himself backward, but the alley was too narrow. Morrison grabbed Chen and dove behind a stone trough. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. When Morrison looked up, Henderson was down. So were 2 others. The shrapnel had nowhere to go in the narrow alley except into flesh. Henderson was still alive, but his legs were shredded. He screamed and screamed. Morrison crawled to him, applied a tourniquet, morphine, called for stretcher bearers, all while waiting for the sniper he knew was watching. The sniper who would shoot anyone who came to help. But the shot never came. Instead, Morrison heard boots on cobblestones. German voices. Close. Moving toward them. "Defensive positions," Morrison hissed. His men flattened against walls, rifles ready. Morrison could hear the Germans clearly now. 2 of them, maybe 3, talking casually. They had no idea the Canadians were 15 feet away around a corner. Morrison raised his rifle, aimed at the corner, waited. A German paratrooper stepped into view. Morrison fired. The German went down. Another paratrooper appeared, rifle coming up. Mackenzie, who had circled around from the other direction, shot him from behind. The German fell forward onto the cobblestones. Silence. Morrison approached the bodies carefully. Both men were young, 20, maybe 22. They wore the distinctive smocks of Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, Green Devils. One of them had a photo tucked into his helmet band. A girl, pretty smile, blonde hair. Morrison looked away. Couldn't think about that. Couldn't wonder if the girl knew yet that she was looking at her last photograph of someone who would never come home. He searched the bodies quickly, found maps, German positions marked. He pocketed them. "Sir," Chen called. "Movement, 3rd floor." Morrison looked up, saw a shadow in a window, raised his rifle. The shadow vanished. They're above us, Morrison said. Always above us. They extracted carefully carrying Henderson and the other wounded, made it back to the square where Fraser had established a command post. The lieutenant looked worse. More casualties. Mackenzie's section had run into mines, S-mines, bouncing Betties the soldiers called them, spring-loaded to jump to waist height before detonating, designed to castrate and kill. Fraser was writing casualty reports. His hands shook. 23, he said when Morrison approached. 23 casualties, and we haven't even cleared the first block. Morrison showed him the German maps. Fraser studied them, his face going pale. They've fortified every building, Fraser said. Every single one. This isn't a town, it's a fortress. Yes, sir. We can't advance like this. We'll be bled dry before we reach the center. Morrison said nothing. They both knew the truth. If they kept fighting in this way, using standard infantry tactics, the entire battalion would be destroyed within 48 hours. But what other way was there? Night fell on December 20th, with the Canadians holding exactly one city block. They'd lost 45 men, killing or wounding, perhaps 10 Germans. The math was unsustainable. Morrison sat in what had once been someone's kitchen, now missing its roof from artillery. Around him, the surviving men of his section tried to rest. Most couldn't. The adrenaline was too high, the fear too fresh. Mackenzie came in, his shoulder now properly bandaged. How's Henderson? Dead, Morrison said. Bled out on the way to the aid station. Mackenzie absorbed this. Henderson had been 19, from a small town in Ontario. He'd talked constantly about his girlfriend back home, how they were going to get married when the war ended, buy a little house, have kids. Now he was dead in an Italian alley because he'd opened a door. This is bad, Bill, Mackenzie said quietly. Worse than anything we've seen. Morrison knew. Italy had been hard, Sicily had been brutal. But this was different. This was systematic slaughter. The Germans owned every angle, every sight line, every approach. They'd had weeks to prepare. They knew the ground. They had the better positions. And the Canadians were learning for the first time what it meant to fight an enemy who was genuinely better than them. Chen appeared in the doorway. Sir Lieutenant Fraser wants to see you. Planning session. Morrison followed Chen through the rubble to a basement that Fraser had turned into a command post. Maps covered a makeshift table. Candles provided light. Fraser was there. So were the other section commanders. 8 men total. All that remained of a full-strength platoon. Fraser looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. Gentlemen, he said, we have a problem. Battalion expects us to resume the attack at dawn. But if we continue using frontal assaults, we'll be wiped out within 2 days. I need ideas. Anything. Silence. Where's down? Aha, finds. What could they say? The enemy had every advantage. Morrison studied the maps, aerial photographs of Ortona. The town was a maze. Narrow streets, buildings pressed together, medieval layout designed for defense. The streets are killing us, Morrison said slowly. Every time we use a street, they're waiting. Then we don't use the street, someone suggested. Go through the buildings. We tried that, booby-trapped, every door, every staircase. More silence. Chen spoke up. Sir, can I see the map? Fraser slid it over. Chen studied it carefully. Morrison watched the young mechanic's eyes move across the town layout, saw him thinking, processing. These buildings, Chen said, they're terrace houses, like in Vancouver's Chinatown, built right next to each other, shared walls. So the walls are the only thing separating them. If we could get through one building, then we could go through the wall to the next building. Never use the street, never use the doors. Morrison leaned forward. Go through the walls. Blow holes in them, big enough for a man to fit through, move from building to building without exposing ourselves to machine gun fire. The idea hung in the air. It was crazy. It violated every tactical doctrine. You cleared buildings floor by floor, room by room using doors and stairs. You didn't blow holes in walls like some kind of burglar. But then Morrison thought about Jack dying on Dieppe Beach because doctrine said frontal assault still worked. Thought about Henderson bleeding out in an alley because doctrine said you advance down streets. Thought about the growing pile of body bags because everyone kept following the same playbook the Germans had already figured out how to beat. That's insane, Fraser said. But he didn't say no. Morrison could see the lieutenant's mind working, weighing options, doctrine versus survival. Sir, Morrison said carefully, Jack died at Dieppe because we followed the book. I'm done following books that get my men killed. Fraser looked at him, really looked at him. Saw something in Morrison's eyes that made him nod slowly. Can we do it? Fraser asked Chen. Technically, can we actually blow through these walls? Chen thought about it. The buildings are stone and brick, old construction, maybe 18 inches thick. We'd need shaped charges, something to direct the blast inward instead of just scattering. And we'd need to be precise. Too much explosive and we bring the whole building down on our heads. Can you make these charges? Maybe, with PE4 explosive and some ingenuity, but I'd need time to test, to figure out the right amount. Fraser looked around the room at the other men. Anyone think this won't work? Everyone thought it wouldn't work. You could see it in their faces. But everyone was also calculating the alternative. More street fighting, more machine gun fire, more Hendersons. I think we're going to die either way, Mackenzie said. Might as well die trying something new. Fraser made his decision. Morrison, take Chen and work on this tonight. I'll stall battalion until noon tomorrow. If you can make it work, we try it. If not, we go back to standard assault and pray. Morrison nodded. Yes, sir. He and Chen left the command post and found a ruined building on the edge of the Canadian perimeter. Chen gathered materials, PE4 plastic explosive, detonation cord, timers. He worked with the focused intensity of a man who understood that lives depended on getting this right. Morrison watched him shape the explosive into a cone. Why that shape? Shaped charges work by directing the blast, Chen explained. Instead of the explosion going everywhere, the cone focuses it into a penetrating jet. Tank killers use the same principle. Will it work on walls? In theory. Chen positioned the charge against a section of brick wall. Stand back, sir. They moved to cover. Chen lit a fuse. 5 seconds. The explosion was sharp and focused. When the dust cleared, there was a hole in the wall, ragged, maybe 2 feet across, but definitely a hole. Chen examined it critically. Needs more explosive and better shaping. But the concept works. They spent the next 4 hours refining the technique, testing different amounts of explosive, different shapes, different positions on the wall. By dawn, Chen could reliably blow a hole 3 feet in diameter through 18 inches of brick and stone. Morrison looked at the final test hole. You could fit a man through it, just barely, crawling, but definitely passable. This might actually work, he said. It will work, Chen replied. He sounded certain. The question is whether we'll survive using it. Fair point. December 21st, dawn. Morrison presented the plan to Fraser. We pick a row of terrace houses, 5 buildings connected. Germans occupy the middle 3. We hold the first. We blast through from the top floor. Move through the attics. Come at them from angles they're not watching. Fraser listened, nodded. Battalion approved a limited test. 1 section. If it works, we expand. If it fails. He didn't finish. Everyone knew what failure meant. Morrison picked his best men. Mackenzie, despite his wounded shoulder. Chen, obviously. 6 others. 9 men total. Enough to clear buildings, but not so many that losing them would cripple the unit. They moved into position at 0530 while it was still dark. Occupied the first terrace house. Moved quietly to the top floor. Chen placed his charge against the far wall, the wall that separated them from the next building. Morrison gathered his men close. When it blows, we go through fast. Grenade first, then suppressive fire, then entry. Just like we trained. Except we're coming through a wall instead of a door. The men nodded. They looked scared. Morrison didn't blame them. He was scared too. Chen, Morrison said, do it. Chen lit the fuse. They had 5 seconds. Morrison counted them in his head. 5, 4, 3, 2. The explosion was louder than expected in the enclosed space. The wall didn't just crack. It erupted inward. Bricks and mortar and dust filled the room. Visibility dropped to 0. Morrison couldn't see his hand in front of his face, but he'd memorized where the hole should be. He pulled a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, threw it blindly through the dust cloud toward where the hole had to be. 4 seconds. The grenade detonated. Morrison heard screaming. German voices, confused, panicked. Mackenzie was already moving. The big logger stuck his Sten gun through the hole and fired. Full magazine. 32 rounds in 4 seconds. The sound was deafening. Then Morrison was moving, diving through the hole, rolling, coming up with his rifle. The dust was clearing. He could see now. A bedroom. German equipment scattered on the floor. Blood on the walls. 2 bodies. 1 German paratrooper still alive, staggering, reaching for his weapon. Morrison shot him. Point blank. The man fell. Mackenzie came through behind him. Then Chen. Then the others. They cleared the room in seconds. Moved to the next wall. Chen placed another charge. Again the explosion. Again the dust. Again the dive through into the next building. This time they found the room empty. The Germans had fled. Hearing the explosions, not understanding what was happening, their carefully prepared defenses suddenly irrelevant because the enemy wasn't coming through the doors. Morrison's section moved through 5 buildings in 30 minutes. They didn't use a single street, didn't trigger a single booby trap, emerged on the far side of the block, having bypassed every German position. 0 casualties. When they radioed back to Fraser, there was a long pause before the lieutenant responded. "Say again, Captain." "0 casualties." "Confirmed, sir. 0. The technique works." Another pause. Morrison could almost hear Fraser's mind recalculating. If they could advance without casualties, if they could bypass the German defenses entirely. "Hold position," Fraser said. "I'm calling battalion." Within an hour, the order came down. All Canadian units in Ortona would adopt the mouse-holing technique immediately. Chen would train other sappers. Morrison would write tactical notes. The entire operational plan was changing. Across the street in a German observation post, Hauptmann Weber watched through binoculars. He'd seen the Canadians enter the first building, watched his men prepare to ambush them when they emerged onto the street. But they never emerged. Instead, he heard explosions, muffled, coming from inside the buildings, dust puffing from third-floor windows, then silence. Then his radio crackled. The squad in those buildings wasn't responding. Weber sent another squad to investigate. They found the buildings cleared, Germans dead or captured, and holes. Jagged holes blown through walls. A tunnel from house to house. Weber stared at the holes. He'd fought Russians, Americans, British. He'd never seen anything like this. "Oberst Steiner," he radioed to his commander. "The Canadians have found a way around our defenses." "Explain." "They're not using the streets, sir. They're tunneling through the walls. We can't stop them because we never prepared for this." Long silence on the radio, then Steiner's voice cold and hard. "Then we adapt, Hauptmann. Make them pay for every building. Make them pay in blood." "Yes, sir." But Weber's hands were shaking as he lowered the radio because he understood what this meant. The Canadians weren't following any known tactical doctrine. They were inventing, improvising, learning faster than the Germans could adapt. These weren't the amateur farm boys intelligence had promised. These were something else entirely. That night, Weber wrote in his journal, a habit from years of combat. He found that writing helped process things, made sense of chaos. December 21st, 1943, he wrote, "The Canadians did something today I've never seen in 3 years of war. They showed innovation under pressure. They adapted when their tactics failed. They thought like engineers, not soldiers." He paused, thought about his daughter, about Greta asking when Papa would come home. "I begin to wonder," he continued writing, "if we will hold this town, not because the enemy is stronger, but because they refuse to fight the way we expect." He closed the journal. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, more dying. But something had changed. The equation had shifted. For the first time since arriving in Ortona, Friedrich Weber considered the possibility that the Green Devils might lose. And in the Canadian lines, William Morrison sat with his men. They were exhausted, filthy, covered in plaster dust and brick powder. But they were alive. All of them. For the first time since entering this cursed town, an entire day of fighting had passed without losing a single man. Mackenzie was grinning. "We beat them, Bill. Actually beat them." Morrison nodded slowly, but he didn't share Mackenzie's joy, because he knew the Germans wouldn't sit idle. They'd adapt, find countermeasures. Tomorrow would be harder. Still, for tonight, they'd won. They'd taken the enemy's best punch and survived. More than survived, they'd evolved. Chen appeared with captured German rations, actual food instead of the usual tinned garbage. They shared it around. Someone produced a bottle of wine from a ruined house. They passed it. To Fraser, someone said, for listening to a crazy idea. To Chen, Mackenzie added, for having the crazy idea. To Jack, Morrison said quietly, and Henderson and Davies and all the others, may we finish what they started. They drank. Tomorrow would bring Christmas and tragedy and an escalation of violence that would shock even these hardened men. But tonight the farm boys had proven something to themselves, to the enemy, to the world. They could learn, they could adapt, they could fight, and they absolutely would not quit. December 22nd through 24th passed in a blur of explosions and dust and death. Morrison's mouse-holding techniques spread through the Canadian battalions like wildfire. What had seemed impossible 3 days earlier now became routine. Blow a hole, throw grenades, suppress with automatic fire, pour through the gap, clear the room, move to the next wall. Repeat. The Germans adapted as best they could. They reinforced interior walls with sandbags. They positioned men specifically to watch for breaches. They rigged entire rooms with explosives hoping to collapse buildings on the Canadians as they tunneled through. Sometimes it worked. Private Collins died when a floor gave way beneath him, dropping him 3 stories into a basement filled with rubble. Sergeant Mitchell triggered a booby trap that killed 2 men and wounded 4 others. The fighting remained brutal and close and personal. But the mathematics had changed. Before mouse-holing, the Canadians were losing 40 men a day for minimal gains. Now they lost 7, 8, 10 at most. Still terrible. Still far too many. But sustainable. Just barely. They pushed deeper into Ortona. Block by block. House by house. The ancient town was being systematically destroyed. Artillery from both sides. Explosives from mouse-holing. Fire from incendiaries. By December 24th, entire streets had ceased to exist as anything but rubble and memories. Morrison barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of walls, of blowing holes through brick and stone forever, of an endless maze where every room held enemies and every door held death. He would wake gasping, reaching for his rifle before remembering where he was. The men were changing too. Morrison could see it in their eyes. The farm boys and loggers and mechanics were being forged into something harder. Something that could function in the chaos of urban warfare. They moved differently now, more cautiously, more deliberately. They'd learned to read buildings, to sense danger, to trust their instincts over their training. Chen had become invaluable. The Chinese-Canadian mechanic could estimate the exact amount of explosive needed for any wall just by looking at it. He taught other sappers his techniques, showed them how to shape charges for maximum penetration with minimum collateral damage. Soldiers who'd ignored him back in England now followed his instructions without question. Mackenzie, despite his wounded shoulder, refused evacuation. He'd bound it tight and kept fighting. The big logger had a talent for close-quarters combat. Something about his size and strength made him devastating in confined spaces. Morrison had watched him clear 3 rooms single-handedly when a mousehole breach went wrong and separated the section. But it was Fraser who held everything together. The young lieutenant coordinated movements, managed supplies, wrote letters to the families of the dead. He looked exhausted, hollow, but he never stopped, never quit. Morrison respected that. December 25th dawned cold and clear. Christmas Day. Morrison woke to the sound of distant artillery, German guns shelling Canadian rear positions. The barrage was half-hearted. Even the Germans seemed tired. 4 days of intense combat had ground both sides down to exhaustion. Word came at 0900 hours. There would be no offensive operations today. Both sides seemed to have reached an unspoken agreement. Christmas deserved at least a pause, if not a proper ceasefire. At 1300 hours, Morrison heard something impossible. Music, an organ, playing Silent Night. He followed the sound to the church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli. The building had somehow survived, mostly intact. Artillery had taken bites out of the walls and blown holes in the roof, but the main structure still stood. Inside, Morrison found something surreal. The Seaforth Highlanders quartermaster had performed a miracle. Long tables covered with white tablecloths, real plates, real silverware, and food, actual hot food. Roast pork, potatoes, vegetables, pudding, even beer. An old Italian organist sat at the church organ playing Christmas carols. The man's hands shook with age or fear or both, but the music was beautiful, haunting. It echoed off stone walls and mingled with the distant sound of machine gun fire. Fraser found Morrison staring at the scene. The quartermaster wanted to do something for the men, Fraser explained. Something to remind them why we're fighting, what we're trying to preserve. Morrison nodded slowly. Civilization. That's what this was. A tiny island of civilization in an ocean of barbarism. We're doing shifts, Fraser continued, 20 minutes each. Eat, rest, then back to the line so the next group can come. Morrison's section got the 1,500 hours slot. They filed in dirty and exhausted, many still carrying their weapons because they didn't trust leaving them behind. The juxtaposition was jarring. Men covered in blood and plaster dust sitting at tables with white linens. Morrison sat between Mackenzie and Chen. The food was placed before them. Real food on real plates. For a moment, nobody moved. They just stared. After weeks of cold rations eaten from tins while crouching in rubble, this seemed impossible. Well, Mackenzie said finally, Merry Christmas, lads. They ate, slowly at first, then faster. The food was good, better than good. It tasted like home, like peace, like a world where men didn't kill each other over ancient Italian towns. The organist switched to the king. Everyone stood automatically, stood to attention in their filthy uniforms with their weapons and their wounds and their exhaustion. The music played. Some men had tears in their eyes. Morrison understood. It wasn't about the king or the anthem. It was about something bigger, something they were afraid they'd lost in the killing. Morrison looked at Chen. Merry Christmas, Tommy. Chen smiled. It was the first smile Morrison had seen on the young mechanic's face in days. First Christmas away from family, sir. We're your family, Bow, Morrison said. He meant it. Mackenzie raised his beer bottle. To absent friends, to Jack, to Henderson, to Davies, to all the boys who didn't make it this far. They drank in silence. The toast was heavy. Too many names. Too many faces that would never see another Christmas. Private Danny Walsh sat across from Morrison, 19 years old, from Nova Scotia. He'd been Mackenzie's friend since basic training. The two of them had bunked next to each other, trained together, shipped overseas together. Walsh was engaged to a girl back home. He showed everyone her picture at least once a day. Pretty brunette named Sarah. They were going to get married when the war ended. Walsh was laughing at something. Morrison couldn't hear what over the organ music, but the boy looked happy, actually happy. For just a moment in this ruined church on Christmas Day, Private Danny Walsh looked like a 19-year-old kid instead of a soldier. See you later, Jimmy, Walsh said to Mackenzie. He stood, picked up his rifle. His 20 minutes were up. Time to rotate back to the front line so the next section could eat. Mackenzie grinned at his friend. Keep your head down out there. Walsh winked. Always do. He walked out of the church. Morrison checked his watch. 15:23 hours. He had 7 more minutes before his own section had to rotate. At 15:26 hours, they heard the shot. A single rifle crack. Sharp and clear even over the organ music. The kind of sound that makes soldiers freeze because they know exactly what it means. Mackenzie was on his feet instantly. Running, Morrison grabbed for him, but the logger was too fast. Out the church door, into the street. Morrison followed, knew he shouldn't, knew it was probably a trap. But Mackenzie was his friend, and friends didn't let friends run into danger alone. The street outside the church was empty. No, not empty. There was something in the middle of the cobblestones. Someone. Danny Walsh lay on his back, eyes open, staring at the sky, a single bullet hole in his chest, right through the heart. He died instantly. Mackenzie reached him, dropped to his knees, grabbed Walsh's shoulders. Danny, come on. You're okay. You're okay. But Walsh wasn't okay. Walsh was dead. Killed 3 minutes after eating Christmas dinner. 3 minutes after laughing. 3 minutes after walking out of a church playing Silent Night. Morrison scanned the rooftops, looking for the sniper. But there was no target, no movement, just silence. More men poured out of the church. Medics ran to Walsh, but there was nothing to do. You couldn't fix a hole through the heart. Chen helped Morrison pull Mackenzie away. The big logger was shaking. Not crying, just shaking, like his body couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. They carried Walsh's body back inside the church, laid him near the altar. The organist had stopped playing. The remaining men in the dining area sat in stunned silence. Fraser appeared, looked at Walsh, looked at Mackenzie, looked at Morrison. "Get your men ready," Fraser said quietly. "We resume operations at dawn." That night, Mackenzie sat alone in a bombed-out building cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. Morrison found him there. "I'm going to kill them, Bill," Mackenzie said. His voice was flat, dead. "Every single one I can find. I'm going to kill them." Morrison said nothing. What could he say? That revenge was wrong, that Walsh's death was just part of war, that they needed to stay professional. All of that would have been true. None of it would have mattered. He was supposed to marry Sarah, Mackenzie continued. They had plans, a little house in Nova Scotia, 3 kids. He wanted 3 kids, a boy and 2 girls. Morrison sat down beside his friend. "I know. 3 minutes. He was alive for 3 minutes after leaving that church, then just gone. How is that fair? It's not. I want them to hurt Bill. I want them to feel what we feel." Morrison put his hand on Mackenzie's shoulder, felt the tension there, the rage barely contained. "They will," Morrison said. "I promise you, Jimmy, they will." December 26th brought intensified fighting. The Canadians, fueled by anger over Walsh's death, pushed harder, more aggressive, more willing to take risks. Morrison's section advanced 3 blocks in 1 day. Unprecedented progress. But the Germans were being pushed back toward their final defensive positions around the town squares, the Piazza Municipio and Piazza San Tommaso. And cornered animals fight hardest, December 27th, 1100 hours. Lieutenant Fraser's platoon secured a corner building overlooking the Piazza Municipio. Perfect position, 3 stories, stone construction, commanding view of the square. From here they could observe German movements, call in artillery, coordinate the final assault. Fraser took 23 men into the building, established an observation post on the 3rd floor, set up a radio, began mapping German positions. Morrison's section was in the building next door, 60 feet away, connected by a shared wall. Morrison was planning the next mousehole breach when he felt it, a vibration, deep, coming from below, like thunder underground. He looked at Chen. "Did you feel that?" Chen's eyes went wide. "That's not artillery. The explosion was massive." The building where Fraser had set up his observation post didn't collapse. It erupted. The entire structure lifted slightly, seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment, then pancaked down on itself. 3 stories compressing into 1. Walls blowing outward. Roof caving in. A cloud of dust and debris that blotted out the sun. The shockwave knocked Morrison off his feet. He hit the floor hard, ears ringing, vision blurred. For several seconds he couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. Then understanding came. The Germans had mined the building, packed the basement with explosives, waited for the Canadians to occupy it, then detonated. Morrison scrambled to his feet, ran to the window. The building next door was just gone. In its place was a mountain of rubble, bricks, timber, bodies, dust still pouring off the pile like waterfall mist. "Fraser!" Morrison screamed. "Lieutenant Fraser!" No answer, just the settling sound of debris, the creak of weakened structures, the beginning of screams from men buried alive. Morrison was moving before conscious thought, out of his building, into the street, to the rubble pile. He started digging, throwing bricks aside, hands bleeding, not caring. Mackenzie appeared beside him, then Chen, then others. They dug frantically, found an arm, pulled. Private Stevens came free, alive but unconscious. They passed him back to medics and kept digging. They found 4 men alive, critically wounded but alive. They found 19 bodies, some intact, some not. Lieutenant David Fraser was in the latter category. Morrison found his class ring on a severed hand, the gold band with the Ontario Teachers College insignia. Fraser had worn it every day, talked about going back to teaching when the war ended. Morrison held the ring, stared at it. Something inside him cracked. He'd lost men before. Henderson, Davies, Walsh, dozens of others. Each death had hurt. But Fraser was different. Fraser had trusted Morrison's crazy ideas, had approved the mouse-holing technique when every regulation said not to, had kept the unit together through sheer force of will, and now Fraser was pieces in the rubble because the Germans had turned an entire building into a bomb. Morrison's hands stopped shaking. His breathing slowed. He felt something cold settle into his chest. Not rage. Rage was hot and temporary. This was different, colder, more permanent. He stood, pocketed Fraser's ring, turned to Chen. "Can you bring down a building?" Morrison asked. His voice was calm, too calm. Chen hesitated. "Sir, can you do it, yes or no?" "Yes, with enough explosive." "But that would be, how much do we have?" "Maybe 40 pounds of PE4. But sir, using it all at once? I don't care. Find me a building with Germans in it. Pack it with every ounce of explosive we have. Then blow it to hell." Mackenzie stepped closer. "Bill, that's a war crime if there are wounded." Morrison turned to look at his friend. Mackenzie saw something in Morrison's eyes that made him stop talking. "They just killed 23 of our men," Morrison said quietly, "including Fraser. They turned a building into a bomb. You want to talk to me about rules?" Silence. The other men watched, waiting to see what would happen, whether Morrison would cross this line. "Find me targets," Morrison said. Now. Within an hour they had one. A building 2 blocks away, German staging area. Intelligence said a full company rotated through there between shifts, 40 to 50 men at any given time. Morrison didn't ask if there were wounded, didn't ask if some of those men might be medics or support staff, didn't ask anything except whether Chen could destroy it. "I can destroy it," Chen said. "But sir, are you sure this is different from combat? This is finishing what they started. Are you with me or not?" Chen looked at Morrison, at Mackenzie, at the pile of rubble that had been Fraser's position. He nodded slowly. "I'm with you." They planned the operation for 1,800 hours. Dusk, when the Germans would be changing shifts, maximum casualties. Morrison, Chen, and 4 others mouse-holed their way to the target building. Slow, careful. It took 90 minutes to cover 2 blocks through the walls. They emerged in an abandoned house directly adjacent to the German position. Through the shared wall, they could hear voices. German, casual conversation, someone laughing. The everyday sounds of soldiers between battles. Morrison felt nothing. No hesitation, no doubt, just cold purpose. Chen placed charges methodically. In the basement, against load-bearing walls, shaped to direct the blast inward and upward. He used every ounce of explosive they had, 42 pounds of PE4, enough to level half the block. 10-minute fuse, Chen said. Gives us time to get clear. Morrison lit the fuse, watched it spark, started counting. They retreated through their mouse holes, fast now, racing against time. Behind them, the fuse burned, counting down, seconds becoming minutes. Morrison was 3 buildings away when he saw it through a window, a German helmet on a table, and next to it a photograph. Young soldier, little blonde girl, maybe 5 years old, sitting on his lap, both smiling. Morrison looked at the photo for 2 seconds, thought about Greta, about Weber's daughter, about all the daughters and sons and hers and mom, mothers who would get telegrams. Then he kept moving. They made it 4 buildings away when the explosion came. The sound was beyond description. Bigger than anything Morrison had heard except naval bombardment. The ground shook. Windows shattered 3 blocks away. A pressure wave that felt like being punched by God. Morrison watched from a 3rd-story window. Watched the German building not collapse but disintegrate. Walls blowing outward in all directions. Roof lifting straight up, then crashing down. Fire erupting from the basement. Debris raining down for 30 seconds. When the dust began to settle, there was no building. Just a crater. And bodies. Parts of bodies. Scattered across 50 yards. Morrison counted silently. Estimated. 40 dead. Maybe 50. More wounded. An entire company essentially wiped out in one explosion. He felt nothing. No satisfaction. No remorse. Just emptiness. They returned to Canadian lines as full dark fell, Captain Andrews Fraser's replacement was waiting. "What the hell did you do?" Andrews demanded. "The Germans are screaming on the radio about war crimes. They're threatening to execute prisoners in retaliation." Morrison met his eyes. "I did what needed doing. You just killed 50 men with a demolition charge. That's not combat. That's murder. They killed 23 of ours the same way. I call it even." Andrews opened his mouth, closed it. He was new, hadn't been at Ortona long enough to understand what this place did to men, how it ground away the parts that made you civilized and left only the parts that let you survive. "This doesn't leave this room," Andrews said finally. "Officially, that was a lucky artillery hit. Understood?" Morrison nodded. Didn't care about official stories. Fraser was still dead. Walsh was still dead. 23 men were still buried in rubble. But now 40 Germans were dead too. The equation balanced. That night, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood in what remained of the German staging area. The crater was 15 feet deep. He could still smell the explosive. Could see the blood on the rubble. An entire company. Gone. Some of these men he'd known for years, trained with, fought with. Now they were pieces. Weber had seen terrible things in this war. The beaches of Crete covered in dead paratroopers, Russian villages burned to ash, mass graves from both sides. But this felt different. This felt personal. He radioed Oberst Steiner. "Sir, we cannot hold. We've lost too many men. The Canadians are matching our ruthlessness step for step. They're not stopping." Long pause, then Steiner's voice, older somehow, defeated. "Prepare withdrawal routes, Hauptmann. Quietly, we evacuate at 2200 hours tomorrow." Weber almost dropped the radio. The Green Devils had never retreated. Not from Crete, not from Russia, nowhere. They were the elite. They didn't run. "Sir, the men will follow orders," Steiner snapped. "We've lost 40% strength. We have no ammunition for sustained combat. And the Canadians are clearly willing to pay any price. There is no shame in tactical withdrawal." The transmission ended. Weber stood in the ruins. Around him, medics were still searching for survivors. Finding none. Just bodies. Just pieces. He thought about Greta, about going home, about surviving. For the first time in 3 years of war, Friedrich Weber felt something he'd never felt before. Fear. Not of dying. He'd made peace with death long ago, but fear that he was on the wrong side. That these farm boys fighting with such determination, such innovation, such willingness to adapt might actually represent something better than everything he'd been fighting for. The thought was treasonous. Dangerous. But Weber couldn't shake it. December 28th, 0400 hours. The final push. Morrison's loyal Edmontons would assault the Piazza Municipio from the north. Mackenzie's Seaforths would take the Piazza San Tommaso from the south. Simultaneous attacks. Coordinated artillery. This was it. The last German strongpoints. Morrison gathered his section. 8 men remained from the original 32 who'd entered Ortona 8 days ago. 8. The rest were dead or wounded or so shell-shocked they couldn't function. "This is the last building," Morrison told them. "One more mouse hole, one more breach. Then we're in the square. After that, we go home." Simple words, but they mattered. Home, the idea of home, of surviving, of this nightmare ending. Chen placed the final charge at Euro 610. Morrison looked at his men, farm boys and mechanics and loggers who'd become the deadliest urban warfare specialists the Allied armies had ever produced. "For Fraser," Morrison said, "for Walsh, for Jack, for all of them." The explosion came. They poured through. The room was defended, but Morrison's section had done this 100 times now. Grenades, suppressive fire, close assault. The Germans fought hard, but they were exhausted, depleted, broken. Morrison was the first Canadian to set foot in the Piazza Municipio. He stood in the square and looked around. The town was unrecognizable. Not a single building intact. Rubble everywhere. Fires still burning. The beautiful medieval town had been reduced to ruins, and it was silent. No machine gun fire. No explosions. Just silence. Morrison's radio crackled. Mackenzie's voice. "South Square secured. Repeat, South Square secured." They'd done it. Taken both plazas. The heart of Ortona was Canadian. But Morrison felt no triumph. Just exhaustion. Across the square in a third-floor window, Weber watched through his rifle scope. He had Morrison centered perfectly. Headshot, maybe 150 yards. Easy for a marksman of Weber's skill. His finger rested on the trigger. Morrison took off his helmet, wiped his face. He looked exhausted, human, just a man who wanted to go home. Weber thought about Greta, about the photo that German soldier had carried, about all the fathers who wouldn't be going home. He shifted his aim, deliberately, fired into the rubble 10 feet from Morrison. Morrison dove for cover, looked around wildly, trying to find the shooter. Weber's spotter stared at him. "Herr Hauptmann, you never miss." "First time for everything," Weber said. He lowered his rifle. "Come, we have withdrawal orders to execute." That night, under cover of darkness, the German 1st Parachute Division slipped out of Ortona. They left behind their dead, their equipment, and a message scrawled on a wall in the command post. "Worthy opponents, 1st Parachute Division." December 29th, dawn, Morrison led a patrol through the German lines, found empty positions, abandoned equipment, no contact. They'd won. The farm boys had beaten the Green Devils. The final count was brutal. Canadian casualties 502 killed, 1,372 wounded. The loyal Edmontons had lost 40% of their strength. The Sea Force, 35%. German casualties were estimated at 400 killed, 800 wounded. Ortona was a ruin, a ghost town, dead, but it was theirs. Morrison stood in what had been the Piazza Municipio and felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction. Just a vast emptiness where his emotions used to be. Captain Andrews found him there. "Battalion wants a report on the mouse-holing technique," Andrews said. "They're going to teach it at all the infantry schools. You've changed how we fight, Morrison." Morrison nodded, didn't care. Fraser was still dead. Walsh was still dead. 23 men were still buried in rubble. "There's something else," Andrews continued. "The war correspondent, Matthew Halton. He wants to interview you. Says this is the most important battle of the Italian campaign." "Tell him no." "Morrison, this is an order from—" "I said no. I'm done talking about it. We fought. We won. That's all there is." Andrews studied him. Saw something in Morrison's eyes that made him nod. "Understood. I'll tell him you are unavailable." He left Morrison alone in the ruins. That night, Morrison visited the makeshift cemetery outside town. Row after row of white crosses. He found Fraser's, placed the class ring on top of the marker. "We finished it, sir," Morrison said to the grave. "Like you wanted. The farm boys won." No response, just wind over the graves. Morrison walked back to his tent, found Mackenzie there. The logger was crying, silently, tears running down his face. "I can still hear him laughing," Mackenzie said. "Danny, in that church, I can still hear it." Morrison sat beside his friend, put an arm around the big man's shoulders. They sat like that until dawn, two survivors trying to carry the weight of all the dead. 51 years later, Ortona, Italy, December 1994. William Morrison was 108 years old. He'd lived a long life after the war, returned to the farm, married, had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. He rarely talked about Ortona. When people asked, he'd say it was a long time ago and change the subject. But on the 50th anniversary, the Canadian government flew him back to Italy for a memorial ceremony. Morrison almost didn't go, but his grandson convinced him. The town had been rebuilt, beautiful again. You'd never know it had been a battlefield. During the ceremony, an elderly woman approached. German accent, maybe 60 years old. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Captain Morrison, William Morrison?" "I am." "My grandfather wrote about you in his journal. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, 1st Parachute Division." Morrison's breath caught. Weber, the name was familiar. He'd seen it in captured German documents. The woman handed him a worn journal. "He passed away 5 years ago, but he wanted you to have this." Morrison opened it, found an entry dated December 28, 1943. "Had Captain Morrison in my sights today. Perfect shot. Could have ended it. But I thought about Greta, about going home, about all the fathers who won't. I let him live, not because of mercy, but because he earned it. The farm boys fought like we do, for their men, not for glory. They deserve to win." Morrison looked up. Your grandfather spared me. He said you were the only enemy he ever respected. Morrison felt tears on his face. First time he'd cried about Ortona in 50 years. I wish I could have met him, Morrison said, to say thank you. The woman smiled sadly. He said the same about you, that in another life you would have been friends. That night, Morrison stood at the memorial. Names etched in stone. Fraser, Walsh, Henderson, Davies, all of them. We did it, he whispered. We beat them. And then we came back and built this. Made it beautiful again. That's the real victory, isn't it? Not the killing, but what comes after. William Morrison died peacefully in 2015, age 110. One of the last survivors of Ortona. The mouse-holding technique he and Chen pioneered is still taught at military academies worldwide. It saved thousands of lives in Aachen, Berlin, Fallujah, Mosul. The farm boys changed warfare forever. Not through strength or technology, but through innovation born of desperation, through refusal to accept death on someone else's terms. They were amateurs who beat professionals, civilians who defeated elite soldiers, ordinary men who did extraordinary things. And they proved something that echoes through history, that when free men fight for each other, for home, for the simple right to survive and build and grow, they cannot be beaten. Not by doctrine, not by experience, not by reputation. The Green Devils were the best, until they met farm boys who refused to quit. That's the lesson of Ortona, not about tactics or weapons or strategy, but about the unstoppable power of ordinary people who decide they've had enough, who decide to fight back, who decide to win.